Hello everybody, this is Gary Mrozinski again, and this is part B of the Chapter 1/2 presentation. And the content from this presentation is taken from The Microeconomy Today by Schiller and Gebhardt, which is published by McGraw-Hill. We're starting Chapter 2 here. We're not doing all of the chapter, but we're just touching on the important concepts that will be helpful as we proceed with microeconomics in this course. And the U.S., in comparing ourselves to the rest of the world, we have less than 5% of the world's population. It's actually 4.4%. And yet we're producing 20% of all the goods and services across the world, 20% of global GDP. We're the largest economy measured in GDP, which means we produce the most. We also consume the most, and that kind of makes sense, right? You produce what you consume what you produce. Because you produce so much, you have the income to be able to consume the equivalent of what you're producing. We don't produce everything that we consume in our economy, however. We import a lot of products. We also export a lot of products. We specialize in producing certain types of goods and services. That's a discussion we'll have in this chapter. What determines what gets produced here within our borders and what gets produced outside of our borders and imported here. It has to do with specialization and opportunity cost. So here's an official definition of gross domestic product: the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's borders in a given time period. It's the total amount of goods and services produced within your borders, the dollar value of the goods and services. So you can think of it as a way to measure this would be to total up all the dollars that were spent to purchase all the goods and services we produced inside our borders. That's GDP, that dollar amount. We are in the tens of trillions of dollars. And so here is a little closer look at what we're producing with our population. 20% of gross world product, we have 4.4% of the world's population. So you would expect, if we are the average economy, that we would have 20% of the world's population if we're producing 20% of the goods and services. But we have a quarter of that. So this means that we're highly productive compared to other economies. We're producing a lot with our population. Our GDP is currently 50% larger than that of China, and the numbers you're going to see on the next slide, that's the case. That was 2018, however, and I'll give you some more up-to-date numbers. China, which is the number 2 economy in terms of GDP, they have 18% of the world's population. They're producing 17% of gross world product. So that's about what you would expect if they're the average economy. And here are GDP numbers from 2018. These are in trillions. So the U.S. was producing $20.6 trillion in GDP, the total dollar value of all the goods and services we produced that year. And China at 13.2, you can see we're 50% larger than that, roughly speaking. Now a trillion, remember, is 1,000 billions. And you can see some of the other economies. Japan was the number 2 economy next to the U.S. for a lot of years, and then China passed them out sometime maybe 12, 15 years ago. Since then, China has been the number 2 economy. Now, they have a much larger population than Japan, much larger than the U.S., in fact, 4 times our size. But they are now the second largest economy and have been for some time. What's really important is GDP per capita. This is the GDP produced per person in your population. This is what's really important. This is a measure of productivity. Now, this is per person in your population, not per person in your labor force. And remember, only about 50% of our population is in the labor force. The other 50% are below 16 years of age, or just not working for personal reasons, like they're in school, or retired. That's a large percentage of our population is now in retirement, or not working for other reasons. Only about 50% of our population is in the labor force. So the reason per capita GDP is so important is because it's the best measure we have that reflects standard of living. So if we want to compare ourselves to people who live in Europe, for example, we can look at per capita GDP. Now, it's not perfect because GDP doesn't really measure everything, doesn't capture everything. First of all, it doesn't measure all the work that's being done exactly. And also, it doesn't reflect necessarily every aspect of quality of life or standard of living. Most obvious example is the quality of the environment. You could have a really high GDP per capita, but a real dirty environment. Well, then what's the quality of life? If you just look at per capita GDP, it looks better than it is, right? So that's something that's not reflected in GDP per capita. China has been struggling with this. They've been having tremendous growth in GDP year to year, 10% for a lot of years from year to year, annual GDP growth. But they've been hesitant to enact stringent environmental regulations because they know that will slow the growth. But it's become such a problem for them now, especially in their industrial centers, air quality and general quality of the environment, that they're starting to realize that they need to get serious about putting in place more stringent environmental regulation because that's affecting their quality of life. Here are some GDP per capita numbers. In 2018, we increased in 2019 to 65,000 per person in our population, and then we had a drop during the pandemic to, I think it was 59,000. And then we bounced back in 2021 back into the 60s, 60,000. So $60,000. It's kind of like an average income per American. And when I teach this in the classroom, we have a discussion about that. Do you think that seems appropriate? 60,000 per person, if that would be kind of like an average income? What do you think, that's high? Do you think that's low? About right? I've always thought that seems high. Because remember, this is per person in the population, not per person in the labor force. So it's not like the average income of a worker is 60,000. The average income of a citizen is 60,000. So if only 50% of your household is in the labor force, then each of those persons needs to be making 120,000 per year to be the average household. So, what's happening here is we're using the arithmetic mean, which can be distorted by extreme measures. We have a small percentage of the population that are making way more than 60,000. And so that brings the average up to 60,000 and makes it a little bit deceivingly high. But that is our GDP per capita. It is a real number. Economic growth, you can measure that two ways. You can measure it in terms of GDP growth or GDP per capita growth. Again, GDP per capita growth is what you want to happen. If your population grows by 3% per year, this is proposing that your GDP is growing by 3% per year, while your population is growing by 1% per year. So that did happen in the U.S. over a long period of time. 3% GDP growth, 1% population growth during those same years. Then your GDP per capita is rising by 2% per year, which is pretty good. It's hard to grow faster than 2 or 3% if you're already pretty productive in terms of GDP per capita. This graph shows you a comparison of population growth to GDP growth. Now, this is real GDP, so none of the growth in GDP that you see on this graph going left to right as time passes, none of that is due to prices rising. That is filtered out, and we're using real GDP numbers. And you can see if it's going uphill, that means you have growth, and population is growing, that's the lower graph, but it's growing at a slower rate than GDP is, which is the point. You want for GDP to grow faster than your population because that means your GDP per capita must be going up. So we have rich nations and we have poor nations. Poor nations tend to have more population growth year to year as a percentage, And the richer nations have lower population growth. The fertility rate, which is the number of children on average that a woman is having in childbearing years, whatever those years are, that's something that's measured each year in these different economies. And in the U.S. right now, we're like around 1.7, 1.8 children per female. And if you have approximately the same number of males and females, then you would want for it to be 2 if you wanted to replace your population. The number of births are matching the number of deaths, right? We actually do have population growth in spite of that, in spite of our fertility rate being less than 2. And it's because of immigration. If we didn't have net immigration, then our population would be shrinking right now. The kinds of goods and services that we produce in our economy has changed a good deal in the last 100 years, and I'll show you a graphic coming up that's going to demonstrate that. But just briefly, 100 years ago, 2/3 of our GDP was farm goods and manufactured goods. So the remaining 1/3 was services then. Today, it's about 80% services and about 20% goods. So why is it that we're producing so much services now? Well, when you think about 100 years ago, incomes were much, much lower for the average American. So if your incomes are very low, a large percentage of your expenditure is on food and housing. So you're spending a lot more on food, so your economy is, as a percentage of the total output, is going to be producing kind of a matching percentage breakdown of food and other things. And this is a good example. In Ethiopia, so this is a poor nation today, the most urgent concern is to keep people from starving, and more than 50% of output still comes from the farm sector, even with the technology we have now in agriculture. And so there is no expenditure on dental services because there's no demand for it. People don't have enough money. There's no demand for vacations, travel and tourism, or even education. Those are big sectors of our economy: healthcare, travel and tourism, and education, especially when you consider higher education. That's a big part of our economy that there just is not a demand for in poor nations because they're spending all of their money on to provide for their families, to purchase the food that they need to sustain themselves, and on housing too. So it's kind of a similar situation if you compare the average American today to 100 years ago. They also did not, I'm thinking of my ancestors, my grandparents, they didn't have any money to spend on dental services. They never went on vacations. My grandparents, it was the norm to leave the educational system after 6th grade and go to work in the coal mines, or if you were a female, in a garment factory. That was much more common. So again, this is how, with economic growth and growth in GDP per capita and average income, how our quality of lives have improved. So here's that graphic I was showing you. Again, there's 2 reasons for the decline in agriculture in terms of the percentage of workers working in these different industries. First of all, it's the improvement in the technology of growing food and distributing food. So mechanized farm equipment, the use of chemicals, pesticides, and fertilizers to make crops more productive. We can produce a lot more food with a fraction of the workers today compared to then. Plus, as I said, the other reason for it becoming a smaller percentage of the labor force is because our incomes have risen by, say, 2% per year over 100 years for the average American. And now there is a market for dental services and other forms of health care and vacation and everything else that we would spend, and banking services even. Again, my grandparents' generation, there was no demand for financial services. Nobody had any money, at least not in my family, on my mother's side and my father's side. There certainly was no investing going on. Well, now those are large sectors of our economy, financial services. So what kinds of products do we produce in the U.S. economy, and what kinds of products are being produced outside of our economy? The kinds of work that have left our economy, I mentioned garment factories. That was a big employer locally in this region. I'm in northeastern Pennsylvania. We had coal mines. I'm talking about the 1800s into the first half of the 1900s. And the garment factories were around until maybe the 1970s. Well, that's low productivity work, which means it's more labor intensive, and the output per labor hour is a lower dollar value than something else that would be more high productivity work. So products like clothing manufacturing, furniture manufacturing. There's not a lot of furniture manufacturing happening in the United States either. If it was happening here, either one of those two types of employers, these would be really low paying jobs because they're low productivity operations. It doesn't take a lot of capital to produce clothing, to produce furniture. We specialize in our economy more capital intensive industries. That's where we have a competitive advantage. We have high dollar capital per worker for workers to use in our U.S. economy. That's not the case in other economies where labor costs are low. If labor costs are low, then it's labor intensive work that they have a competitive advantage in compared to us. So this is the basic reason for certain types of products leaving our economy. Now, there's lots more to say on that, and we have a whole chapter on that coming up, chapter 21. The very last thing we're going to do in this class is we're going to discuss global trade, and that's coming up. The U.S. economy has high value capital. The capital that our businesses have to produce their goods and services is advanced and of high value. And this is just showing you on the right, that would be the average farmer in the U.S., and on the left is the average farmer in some Asian nation. I don't see if it's listed here, India. And that looks like capital that a U.S. farmer would have been using 100 years ago. But you can see how that would affect the productivity of a farmer in India versus a farmer in the U.S. if that's the capital you have to work with. So it makes each worker more productive, which makes your GDP per capita go up. So what can lead to economic growth? What causes economic growth? Technological advancement. So advancement in the agricultural industry, which you just saw, it's technology that has kind of transformed that industry over time. And that happens to all other industries too. When it happens, that makes GDP per capita go up because each worker is producing more goods and services per year. Now this happens unevenly over time. It happens in some industries more than others in any given decade, but there was an acceleration of worker productivity in the U.S. economy in the middle 1990s due to the microchip revolution, really. Advancements in microchip technology. So the microchip is the basic building block of electronics. And over time, more and more processing power on a smaller chip and a smaller device, and that led to handheld devices which have more computing power than rooms full of equipment had like 15 years prior. And so this had a big effect. We think about how it affects our lives because we buy consumer electronics, but it's even more important to our economy because it affects the production technology that businesses have to use. So this is advancements in computer technology, innovations in the microchip. And so this led to the birth of the internet. First of all businesses are affected by that. And it's hard to think of an industry that does not use computers at all. That's a shorter list than thinking about which industries would be positively affected by advancements in computers. Everybody uses computers. I worked in healthcare for 7 years. I worked in manufacturing for 11 years prior to that. Both those industries for sure have benefited, both of those sectors of the economy. Banking services, it's all computer driven. It's all electronic anymore. Even retail. Think about what Walmart is able to do with their sophisticated inventory management systems and logistics control because of how computers have evolved and advanced and costs of computer technology have gone down. So this is a movement that led to rising GDP per capita in our economy beginning in the middle 1990s and has continued to today. Factor mobility can lead to economic growth. Remember, factor is referring to factors of production or resources. Resource mobility, labor mobility, are workers moving out of less profitable markets into more profitable markets. Why would they be profitable or less profitable? Because they are in growing demand or declining demand. And if resources are flowing out of markets that are producing less desirable products and into markets that are producing more desirable products, desirable to the consumer, then you have factor mobility. You want an economic system that facilitates that. The market system economy facilitates that better than does the command system economy, communism, where it's the government, central planning agency, moving factors of production around and trying to figure that out and do that well. So if the system is doing this, then the system has allocative efficiency. We're going to talk more about allocative efficiency in this course. We just sort of brushed on it in the macroeconomics course. We're going to be talking about it quite a bit more in this course. Outsourcing and trade can lead to economic growth because it allows you to specialize in producing those goods and services for which you have a competitive advantage based on opportunity cost. Again, in the U.S., more capital-intensive work is what we do well, and more labor-intensive work, if it can be done somewhere else, then it makes sense for it to be done somewhere else, and then you import those products. And of course, you're exporting at the same time. So that's all we're going to do from Chapter 2. We're going to pick this up again with Chapter 3. We are going to do Chapter 3 in its entirety. It's that important of a chapter. That's the chapter on supply and demand. So I'll see you in Chapter 3.